Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Chelsea Ross. I'm the Deputy Director at the Partnership for Strong Communities. Kaylee Pratt is here, a Senior Policy Analyst, assisting me as well today. The CAHC features local, state, and national experts that lead conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues in our state. Join the conversation at #CAHC 2022 on Twitter and follow us at PSC Housing if you aren't already. This session is entitled Racial Residential Segregation and Housing Opportunity. And before I turn it over to our presenters, we'd like to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, the Rosa Building Group, the Melville Charitable Trust, and Wells Fargo. Their deep support has allowed the conference to happen again this year. Thank you also to our collaborating sponsors and our armful of supporting sponsors that have helped make the conference happen again. Thank you. Last but not least, a big thank you to the sponsor for this session, Berkshire Bank. And a quick note that PSC's housing data profiles are updated. You can access the latest in housing data for all of Connecticut's towns and cities in an online interactive format. I'll drop a link to those in the chat in just a second. Each housing data profile contains a summary of important information in each town. You can get the fast facts on affordable housing or do a deep dive into the distribution of your city's housing costs. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded and we'll make all recordings available as soon as possible. All participants have been entered muted. Please remain on mute unless a speaker has asked you to unmute. If you have a technology issue, please select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send it in the chat to myself. I will do my best to assist you. Your speakers today will let you know how they would like content questions to be submitted. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to get you started. Stephen?
Yes, good morning. My name is Stephen Menendian. I am the Director of Research and Assistant Director at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. It's great to be here this morning with you and my colleague Samir Gambir, who is the Director of the Equity Metrics Program, also at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. It is a brisk, cool morning here in California. I'm sure it's probably even cooler where you are in Connecticut, but it's a pleasure to be with you. Let me see if I can start the screen share and we'll get started right away. Okay, it looks like it may be working. I'm going to go into slideshow mode.
Looks good, Stephen.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. So we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to try and move quickly, and I may skip through some slides, so just bear with me. We want to make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A. Chelsea, if you're still with us, when's our hard stop for start Q&A?
That's up to you. You have until 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I can't do the quick
Okay.
on your end. So I think, it'd be great if you could leave about 15 minutes for Q&A for folks.
Perfect.
But
that's what
we'll
we plan. We'll try and do that. All right. So the title of this session is Racial Residential Segregation and Housing Opportunities. And there's a lot embodied in that and embedded in that. So the first thing, I want to spend just a couple of slides going over key concepts and key terms in a more rudimentary and fundamental way so that we're really clear on what it is we're talking about. One of the reasons is that affordable housing and fair housing are frequently conflated as concepts, but they're not the same thing. So this is an affordable housing conference, and I hope that we bring a little bit of a fair housing dose or lens to it. So maybe you've thought about this, maybe you haven't thought about this. There are some people who have spent their entire careers trying to challenge or redefine these terms. I won't mention who those people are. If you want to privately email me, I will tell you who they are. But one of the things that's important to understand is there is a long history to both of these terms. And by the way, they're also confused with other related things. So affordable housing is also conflated with what's called housing affordability. Let me actually tell you, so your mind isn't focusing on that nuance, what the difference is there. Journalists, when they talk about housing affordability, they're mostly talking about the median price of a home. So they're saying, so at the median, the middle class home buyers or home seekers, housing is unaffordable or too expensive. Housing has become less affordable, which is not the same thing as affordable housing, which generally means one of two things. It means the tranche of housing that is available to very low income or a very low income segment of the housing market, like starter homes. So that's, but that's not really what we mean by affordable housing in this context. We're really talking about two things. We're talking about subsidized housing. So subsidized housing meaning housing that is made to be affordable for low income or very low income people through direct or indirect government subsidies. So a direct government subsidy would be like LIHTC, where it's a supply side affordable housing scheme where there are tax credits awarded. So it's, I guess you could consider it indirect in the sense that instead of actually directly outlaying funds from the Treasury, it's actually an absence of funds that come in because it's a tax credit. But that's an example of direct subsidized housing. I guess another direct demand side would be the voucher program, the housing choice voucher, formerly known as Section 8. So subsidized housing is often what's meant by affordable housing. Another form of affordable housing would be filtered housing. That is, housing that may have once been market rate, but over time through competition in the market becomes more affordable over time because it's older, because it's not as desirable, so on and so forth. There is a huge and fiercely debated literature on whether filtering occurs, when it occurs, under what conditions. I'm not here to debate that. I just want to indicate what people mean when they say affordable housing, as opposed to housing affordability or fair housing. Whereas fair housing, in contrast to affordable housing, relates to discrimination, segregation, and integration. So affordable housing is an economic concept, whereas fair housing is a identity concept. It relates to racial groups, familial status, disability, veteran status, whatever. It's identity versus economics. And the reason this is important to keep in mind is because there is a long origin process to fair housing. So there was, coming out of the Great Migration, and particularly post-World War II, open housing movements sprouting up across the country. And these open housing movements were in places like Chicago and Detroit and Seattle. There were places where there were large and growing Black populations from Black families moving out of the South, Black workers moving out of the South, and they couldn't get access to housing, particularly in the North, because in the North, as contrasted with the South, there were strong racial covenants. There was violence to Black movers who would move into white neighborhoods. There were all sorts of enforcement mechanisms. In the South, segregation was mostly occupational, was mostly sort of life, parks, public accommodations, restaurants, and so on. In the North, it was much more rooted, in the North and the West, it was much more rooted in housing. And so these open housing movements were essentially groups like the Urban League and the NAACP were pushing local municipalities to adopt open housing ordinances that would prohibit discrimination in the sale, rental, or leasing of housing. And so if you read, for example, Thomas Suguru's history of Detroit in the origin of the urban crisis, he'll talk about those movements, how public housing movements in the post-war period, there were large pushes to try and open that housing up to Black home seekers. That's why it was called the open housing movement. And so they were adopting what were called open occupancy laws, as I just mentioned. And in the 1950s, there were lots of jurisdictions that actively considered these laws. So St. Paul, Minnesota, actually, and Minneapolis, they had created commissions, human rights commissions to study these. The same thing happened in Louisville. The same thing happened in all sorts of mostly northern cities, Chicago, elsewhere. But there was very little movement to actually adopt in these open housing ordinances. The critics and real estate associations fiercely opposed them as forced housing. The first city that actually adopted an open housing ordinance was New York City in 1957. The New York State legislature adopted their first fair housing ordinance in 1961. I believe the first state to have adopted a fair housing law was Oregon in 1959. California adopted one in 1963, and it wasn't uncommon that these laws would be challenged in court or they would be challenged by ballot initiative. So when California adopted the Rumsford Act in 1963, the state voters actually overturned it with the Proposition 14 a year later, and then the state California Supreme Court overturned that 2 years after that. So there were intense fights over these laws. And by the time the Federal Fair Housing Act was adopted in 1968, about between 19 to 21 states had adopted fair housing laws, including the District of Columbia, along with dozens perhaps several hundred municipal jurisdictions had some form of these. But the main point is these laws were not just public accommodations laws. They actually prohibited discrimination in sale, rental, or lease. And some of them were stronger, some of them were weaker. The enforcement mechanisms varied, but that's basically the gist. Now, why was the shift from open to fair housing? Was that fair housing was viewed as a frame that was more effective in persuading jurisdictions to adopt these ordinances, right? Forced housing was a very powerful argument against fair housing laws. And so instead of open to forced, proponents of these laws adopted the frame of fair housing. I mention all of that because I don't want to conflate it with affordable housing. I think it really is distinct and different, right? Again, affordable housing is an economic basis. Fair housing is about identity, principally race, but not just. Today, fair housing ordinances, depending on the particular ordinance, protect people on the basis of a number of enumerated group categories. Okay, hopefully we're clear on that. I didn't intend to spend quite that much time on that idea. Now let's talk about segregation and be really clear on the terms here as well. So segregation is the separation of people in any particular domain: housing, education, public accommodations, employment. It just is separation of people. Racial segregation is the separation of people on the basis of race. It's not the only form of segregation that exists. In many places in the world, there is religious segregation. So in Northern Ireland, the Catholics and the Protestants are segregated into different residences. In India, you have caste segregation, which is a form of religious segregation. In other places, you have tribal or ethnic segregation. So segregation can also be gender-based. It can be, you can separate the genders in terms of schooling or recreational activities. So there's all sorts of sex and gender segregation. There are many forms of segregation. And then finally, there's racial residential segregation, which is the spatial separation of people in terms of residence, meaning housing on the basis of race. And again, you can have gender residential segregation, religious residential segregation. You can have gender occupational segregation or gender educational segregation. There's many different forms. So it's really important that we're clear on what we're talking about. It is a mouthful to constantly use the term racial residential segregation, but it avoids conflating it with other forms of segregation. And many of these other forms of segregation are coterminous or coexistent. So for example, Tesla, Elon Musk's car company, has been accused by the state of California of segregating by race in terms of occupation and employment within its facilities. So there's many different forms of segregation. It's really important that we're clear and nuanced in our terminology. Now, I'm going to go even deeper here, so bear with me. I'm going to try and move quickly. There have been many ongoing and unresolved debates on exactly how to measure these phenomena. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is measuring racial residential segregation. Samir is going to talk about our tool, our mapping tool, and data for how we've mapped segregation, racial residential segregation, and he's going to show some slides and data that we've generated for Connecticut we think will be useful and helpful and revealing for you. There are dozens of different measures and formulas for segregation. We have focused in our research on about 7 of them. I'm only going to talk about 3 just because of time. And these, I'm going to share 3 of the most prominent, and I'm going to share a 4th one that is the one that we prefer. So the first measure of segregation, it's the one that's probably the most popularly used in the economic and sociological literature on segregation, is called the Dissimilarity Index. Now, the Dissimilarity Index is a binary measure of segregation, meaning it looks at 2 groups at once to see how segregated they are, and it runs from 0 to 100 or 0 to 1, with 100 indicating sort of perfect or complete segregation, and 0 meaning complete integration, meaning that there is no separation of races, of the 2 racial groups across a space. It could be a neighborhood, a jurisdiction, or a metropolitan region. So to give you a sense of how the Dissimilarity Index runs in the United States, as of the 2020 census, which was released paradoxically last year, the national black-white dissimilarity score is 55. Again, this, if it runs from 0 to 100, this means that the United States is more segregated than it is not segregated. It's considered in the moderate high range of segregation. It's a high level of segregation because it means, as a matter of fact, that 55% of Black or white residents would have to move to the different race neighborhood to completely integrate this country. What it means is that we are still a segregated country. So let me show you just a couple of quick charts. Oh, and by the way, the Hispanic white dissimilarity score is 45 and the Asian white dissimilarity score is 40. These are still moderate to high levels of segregation, indicates a segregated country. Now this table, you might notice, this table right here, you'll notice sort of has a mountainous curve, right? It's sort of a steep ascent up and then a slow descent down. This is the calculated dissimilarity score for the United States, black-white dissimilarity score over the course of 110 years, from 1910 to 2020. And what it shows, and the important thing it shows, is that at the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was not a segregated country in terms of residence and housing, which is paradoxical. Most people think that coming out of Jim Crow, or as Jim Crow started, the United States was already segregated. It's not true. We were segregated in the South, as I said earlier, in terms of public accommodations, in terms of education, in terms of work, etc. But we were not actually a residentially segregated country. You notice between 1910 and 1930 was really when the country became a segregated country. That's when the slope is the steepest. And then this continued in the post-war period, bolstered and supported by federal government and state and local governments until it peaked in 1970. And you'll know that the Federal Fair Housing Act, as I mentioned before, was enacted in 1968, goes into effect in 1970, and there's been a sort of gradual sloping descent since. Now, the thing I want you to pay attention to is that the slope of the descent has actually slowed in the intervening decades. So there is an 8.4 absolute decrease in the dissimilarity score between 1970 and 1980, which was the biggest decrease. And then between 1980 and 1990, there was a 5.8 decrease, and it's slowed ever since. The rate of decline has slowed, and we don't know exactly what it's going to be in the next 10 years, but I think it's going to be very, very modest, if any. Okay, so that's the first measure of segregation. The second, these are actually two different measures of segregation, but they're connected, as you'll understand for a moment. These are called the isolation and the exposure indices. So the exposure and the isolation index measure the average neighborhood of a member of a particular racial group. So if you are Black, or you're Asian, or you're white, or you're Hispanic, it asks and looks and says, what is the composition, the composition of the average person of your racial group? And the isolation index does this for the member of your racial group, and then the exposure index does this for the members of other racial groups. So let me just show you what this looks like. In 2020, the average white resident of a metropolitan area resided in a neighborhood that was 69% white, 9% Black, 12% Hispanic, and 6% Asian. Now, the components of this that are the isolation index are the percent Black, Hispanic, and Asian, and the isolation index part is the percent white here. In contrast, a typical African-American resident in the United States, this is based on 2020 data, resides in a neighborhood that is 41% Black, 34% white, 17% Hispanic, and 6% Asian. So these are, aside from the percentage Asian, demographically different worlds. And you can do the same thing for other racial groups. So what it really shows you is just how segregated we are in a way that's more profound and more visible than what the dissimilarity index shows, right? It shows, the dissimilarity shows how separated we are. The isolation and exposure indices show how different the environments that we live in are. And so this is, and in some ways, the exposure index is, particularly Black-white exposure, is a more revealing measure of segregation than dissimilarity. And this chart actually shows the profound difference. So this is showing here the percentage of, let's make sure I'm getting this right. This is showing the percentage of, I think this is the percentage of, yeah, Black people in a white neighborhood. And what you can see here is that sorry, that's not right. This is the percentage of white people in a Black neighborhood. Thank you. So what you can see here is that in 1940 was the most segregated Black community, integrated Black neighborhoods were, because the percentage of, as it shows here, white people living in Black neighborhoods is 40%. It declined to 35%. It reached its nadir in 1980, and now has actually gone, it went back up to 35 in 2010, has gone back down. So according to the exposure index, we're actually more segregated in 2020 than we were in 2010. that is to say Black communities were. Okay, hopefully that's clear. I could spend all day talking about these, but we have a lot of ground to cover. So I'm just going to talk about one more thing and a little bit about our research before handing it over to Samir. The third measure of segregation we use is called the Divergence Index. This is a relatively new measure of segregation. It was created in the last 10 years. And the real value of this index is it allows us to measure multiple groups at once. So you'll notice that the exposure, isolation, and dissimilarity indexes are binary. They look at two racial groups simultaneously unless you aggregate them. The divergence index allows us to look at multiple groups simultaneously, and it gives us a holistic score for all of them. So what it does is it measures and compares the proportion of racial groups in a region or a larger geography, it could be a city or a region or a county, to a smaller geography. So it looks at a census tract to a county or a census tract to a municipality. And the more that those proportions differ for all racial groups, the more it is said to diverge. The larger the score, the higher the score rather, the more the tract diverges from the larger region, suggesting that it is more segregated. And we found in a study that we published last year that 54% of metropolitan regions with more than 200,000 residents in the United States were more segregated as of 2020 than they were in 1990. And 23% were more segregated in 2020 than they were in 2010. So all of this suggests that, contrary to the story that would be suggested by the Dissimilarity Index, the United States is actually becoming more segregated, not more integrated. Again, it depends on the measure that you use. And this is not an abstract problem. We found that there were consistently, along with the economic and sociological literature, negative, deleterious effects of growing up in particularly segregated neighborhoods of color. So for example, neighborhood poverty rates were highest in segregated communities of color. They were 3 times larger than in segregated white neighborhoods, or in twice as large in integrated neighborhoods. Black children raised in integrated neighborhoods earn significantly more as adults per year, and even much more than that when raised in segregated white neighborhoods than those raised in highly segregated communities of color. And we found that 83% of neighborhoods that were given poor or D, C or D red line, rather D grading by the 1930s Homeowners Loan Corporation were, as of 2010, still highly segregated communities of color. There's a lot that we found. This table sort of walks through some of our main findings with respect to life expectancy, educational attainment, rents, unemployment, et cetera. Again, the differences between integrated neighborhoods, highly segregated communities of color, and highly segregated white neighborhoods are significant. And we also found similarly different outcomes for children depending on the neighborhoods they grew up in. So the neighborhoods that children grew up in really mattered. And it wasn't just about in other words, the environment had an individual effect irrespective of the race of, or a directional effect irrespective of the race of the individual. So Black children, again here, growing up in highly segregated white neighborhoods had much better outcomes than Black children growing up in highly segregated communities of color. So segregation is very profound. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Samir. Let me make sure I can do the, make sure I can do the screen share handoff here.
It's okay, Steve. Maybe I can share my screen.
I got it. There you go. Yeah. Stop slide control. Did you get it?
Let me see. Not yet.
It says participants. Okay, I'll just pass it. Yeah, just go ahead and share your screen. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Just give me 1 second. Can you guys see my screen?
Looks good, Samir.
Great, thank you. Sorry, give me 1 second. Thank you, Stephen. Hi, everyone. Nice to be with you. Starting from where Stephen left off, I want to share with you the interactive web map that we created to display some of the segregation measures that Stephen shared and much more. So we really wanted to kind of ensure that the users can visualize the spatial distribution of these various segregation measures. So we create this web map, and I'll walk you through some of the features, but I'll encourage you to explore this more on your own. So on the landing screen, what you see is basically a map of all the metro areas in the US and all the counties outside metro. And what we're showing here is a measure called segregation integration measure, which is a functional measure that we developed using a combination of divergence index, as Stephen talked about, the diversity and racial demographics. And you see three different categories or three different colors on the map. The red color shows high segregated metros or counties, and blue shows racially integrated. The light gray ones are low medium segregation, and the dark gray ones are the ones we didn't have data for in 2020. Before I start showing different functionality of this web map, I want to say that on the left-hand side, the how to use button, if you click on that, it will provide you with an excellent video that walks you through every aspect and the navigation of the web map. So you can follow along and do it on your own. But let me start here on the left-hand corner, where you can enter an address to find the level of segregation for any geography, and you can put any address of your choosing. But let me put in the address of maybe the Office of Partnership for Stronger Communities, which is 227 Lawrence Street, Hartford. When I click on it, it'll actually allow me to select the right formatted address. When I click on this right address, it'll zoom to the location where where the address is, and some of the geography around it. So let me go ahead and click on that. So the marker shows the address, geocoded address, and you see the census tract. There's a brief note here. It says that it's showing tracks right now. It's short-lived, it'll go away. And you see all these red tracks around this tract as well, which shows this is highly segregated. If I click on this tract, what I see on the left-hand side is a lot of information for this tract itself. Its tract number, the city that it is in, the metropolitan area that it is in, the segregation level, and it also gives you the racial breakdown of this census tract. So this census tract in 2020 was 1% Asian, 19% Black, 71% Latino, and 6% white. Another interesting feature of this web map is that you can go back in time. We have data from for each census year from 1980 onwards, so you can actually follow along and go back either one or multiple years. So you can go back to 2010, and you'll see the change in the demographics for this census tract. Likewise, you can go back to 2000, 1990, and so on and so forth. So let me get it back to 2000. So if you're looking at this, you can actually track the trend of how this tract has has a changing segregation level, diversity level, and racial demographics as well. Another interesting feature of this web map is that you can change the geography. So right now you're seeing tracts, but I can click on the city, and it'll show the boundaries of Hartford City, and I can also change it to metro areas and counties. And I'll zoom out, and when I click on this, you will see that the left-hand side gives you the demographic distribution of metro area. So the Hartford metro is in 2020 is 5% Asian, 11% Black, 15% Latino, and 64% white. So if you're following along, you'll see that it's Latino, but the tract was 71% Latino. So you see the reason why the tract is more segregated because comparing the tract racial demographics to the metro level demographics. Stephen mentioned a few of the segregation measures, but we actually collected data on 6 different measures and have data displayed on 35 different segregation values. And you can look at all these different values on our web map if you click on measures of segregation. All these measures are categorized to these different categories. Like for multi-race, you have divergence, entropy, and we're planning to add diversity index as well. For 2-race, you have divergence, dissimilarity, and exposure. And for single race, you have isolation and location quotient as well. So this is an interesting tool. You can click on any of these measures and it'll start displaying it on the web map. Another interesting part is that you might wonder what these different, what is the definition formulas for these different segregation measures. So you can actually go to our technical appendix and you can find different, the definition and formulas for each of those segregation measures. But you can also, oops, sorry about that. You can also go back and click on Learn, which will provide you with explanation of each of those segregation measures. So you have information about divergence, entropy, dissimilarity. So all those 6 measures that we had have information on. Another interesting feature is that we have curated stories of segregation for a number of cities within the US. If you go to this button called Segregation Stories and click on that, you can see that we have information on these cities and it will show up on the map. Let me zoom out a little bit, but you see these markers on Boston, New York, and 7 other cities. So when you click on this, you read about the history and the current stories of segregation for each of those cities. You can click on Read More. It'll take you to a website which has more information about each of those 9 cities. But in addition to that, we have curated a bibliography of research and studies of stories of segregations of many more cities. Here is a list of all those cities: Alameda, Atlanta, Baltimore, and the list goes on. And I can again show this on the map by clicking on Show Hide button, or I can click on one of these cities and click on this Read Our Local Histories of Segregation, and it'll take you to our web page with all the curated bibliography and detailed information. Sorry about the background noise. In the end, as far as this web map is concerned, I certainly encourage you to explore this more. We've also shown the Hulk boundaries. Stephen was mentioning about this, and we have shown the redlined areas, maps of redlined areas on this web map, so that you can compare. When I click on Show and Hide, it starts showing up on the map, and if I zoom into Hartford, it'll show the redlined areas on the map itself. Last but not the least is this button on the left-hand side, which provides you access to all the data that is embedded in this web map. So when you click on this, it'll open up a form, so you can request all the data that you need for just for your own consumption or for your analysis and research, and we'll provide you that data for free. Going back to the presentation, I'll stop sharing the map. So we have such an extent and scale of data collection that we were able to run a number of analyses. And we curated a list of most to least segregated cities in 2020 for the entire nation. And the threshold for these cities was a population of 200,000 or above. What I'm showing here is top 15 cities, which are highly segregated, in the bottom 15 cities. As you can see, they are arranged by Divergence Index. And as you can see, the most segregated cities are overrepresented by cities in Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, and West Coast cities. The most interesting part of this list is that from our research of these 119 cities, only 2 cities, Colorado Springs and Port St. Lucie, turned out to be integrated based on our measure. Relatedly, we also created a list of most least segregated metros in 2020 with the same threshold, 200,000. And I'm showing here 10 top metros, bottom 10 metros, and a few in between just to highlight the metros in Connecticut. In this slide, you'll see that of the 4 metros in Connecticut, 3 are highly segregated. And 1, the Norwich, New London, Connecticut Metro, is low-medium segregation. And you can review all this list if you click on this link on the mostly segregated metro regions. The other thing we could do with all this data was to actually use this data to show the analysis of segregation and subsidized housing in Connecticut. So I use our segregation data, and I use the subsidized housing data from HUD. And what you see here is data aggregated into 4 categories: racially integrated, low-medium segregation, segregated communities of color, and segregated white communities. The gray bar represents the tracts in each category. Blue bar represents the percentage subsidized housing, and the red represents percentage of subsidized housing units. And we'll focus on the segregated communities of color and segregated white communities only. And you see that only roughly 24% of tracts represent segregated communities of color, but there's a 60% subsidized housing projects and 69% subsidized housing units in these tracts. On the flip side, if you look at the height-wide segregated tracts, there are almost 15% tracts that are represented, but there are 0 subsidized housing. And this picture is nothing new. Like, we know that research has shown that public housing residents in concentrated poverty and segregated neighborhoods are disadvantaged because of, being in a cycle of poverty, being in, the neighborhoods are disinvested. And whereas research has shown that in white communities, there's resource hoarding, opportunity hoarding, and there's limited, there are limits, or they deny people of color and low-income folks in their neighborhoods. And as I said, this is nothing new. We found a similar situation in California as well in 2016 when we did the analysis. And we ended up working with California Housing and Community Development and the Tax Credit Allocation Committee in California to develop a opportunity mapping framework using segregation as one of the filters to look at the distribution of opportunity throughout the state. And HCD and TCAG had utilized that information to incentivize building LIHTC housing in high opportunity areas so we can provide access to opportunity and resources to low-income communities. And I can spend the entire time talking about this. It would need another hour to talk about the HCD project, but that's for another time. But I'll stop here and open it for any questions and answers.
Samir, one of the questions that we got is from Emily Gordon. And if folks have questions, I think this would be a good opportunity to put questions into the chat or into the question filter. But one of the things that their question raises, I'm not going to read the whole question, is the relationship between diversity and segregation, and what kinds of neighborhoods, if you're using a rough heuristic, really can be described as segregated. So one of the problems with using diversity is that there's two problems. One is that there are many different forms of diversity. So we would get emails, Samir and I would get emails from folks in Silicon Valley would say, your map shows that our neighborhood is really segregated, but it's very diverse. We have lots of Jewish people, we have lots of Middle Eastern people, we have lots of different Asian groups. But when you look at the data, it was still like 70% white or 70% white and Asian. So just because there's, that's one of the problems with race as a category, right? Is that there's considerable heterogeneity within racial groups. So someone might be, you might have Japanese or Pakistani or, Indian and Chinese, it's still all subsumed under Asian. Or people could be, from the Middle East or Turkey or whatever. I'm going to get to your question. But the first problem has to do with just the heterogeneity of ethnicity. The second problem is that diversity and segregation are really complicated in their interrelationship. So you can have a neighborhood that is highly diverse and has low levels of segregation, or a neighborhood that is very little diversity and of course is highly segregated. And unfortunately, there are some places that can have low levels of diversity and not show up as very segregated because of the surrounding region. So basically the heuristic that we use in California, which is very diverse, is that in the Bay Area, white people are about 30 to 40% of the population. If you have municipalities or neighborhoods that are 60, 66, even 70% white, those are invariably going to show up as highly segregated because the region is the reference point. If you're in some places in New England where the white population is not 40% or 35% like it is in the Bay Area, but let's say 60% of the population, then an 80% white population community is not necessarily going to show up as highly divergent. So what I have said, we've looked at all of these different measures of segregation, and they all have flaws. And I've tried to highlight some of that. So the Dissimilarity Index is deeply flawed because it's a binary index, number one. Number two, it shows decreases in segregation even where the Exposure Index and the Divergence Index shows increases. So I think what you have to do when selecting the measure is you select a measure that is best for the purposes for which you're using the measure and that is most sensitive to basically the context. If you're in a highly diverse region that has lots of Asian, Black, and Hispanic people, you probably don't want to use the dissimilarity or the exposure isolation index. You probably want to use entropy or divergence. But if you're in a region that's mostly Black and white, let's say has less than 10% Asian and or Hispanic, then dissimilarity and exposure isolation is probably fine. I'm not here to say, Samir and I are certainly not claiming that divergence is the be all end all. But in our comprehensive analysis, we think it's superior to the other measures for most purposes in the context of racial residential segregation, and especially in places that are highly diverse. So yes, there's going to be some places where it's going to flag some high white neighborhoods as being medium or low segregation, and places that are very diverse as being high segregation because of the reference point, because of how it's calculated. But you're going to find serious flaws and even more fatal flaws, in my opinion, in almost every measure of segregation, the reasons I've said. So it may not be perfect. There is no perfect measure. And the search for a perfect measure, in my opinion, is actually the flaw in and of itself. You have to select a measure that's best for the purposes for your research and, more importantly, the context in which you're working. I don't see any other questions, but Chelsea, if you're here, I don't know if you're seeing an influx of questions in the question queue or not.
Stephen, I think that was the last one I saw. So if folks have questions, you're going to want to pop those into the chat. We have about 10 more minutes. You can pick Stephen and Samir's brain, ask questions about the tool. It's a real treat to have them here with us in Connecticut, albeit virtual.
And one of the things that I just mentioned is if you don't like our measure of divergence, you can actually, our mapping tool is designed, you can select whichever one you want. There are over 36 different individual measures on there, right? The 6 main ones, 7 if you count entropy. And isolation is separate. We're actually going to add a new one that's been popularized more recently called the Diversity Index. It's basically the entropy index, but we're going to add it because people think it's different. And you can select any of them, and you can select them for any point in time in the last 40, 50 years. And you can use whichever measure you prefer is best for you. So we're not actually trying to impose our preferred measure. We actually want to provide a resource for you, regardless of which measure you prefer. And we also just have lots of demographic compositional data over time, which is useful in and of itself, even if you don't specifically care about racial residential segregation per se.
Thanks, Stephen. Just to add to that, I mean, we have so much data behind this web map, and we provide this as a free resource to folks. So we have received in the past year almost 100 to 120 different requests from all over the country. People are using this data to analyze, homicidal rates, child well-being, child mortality, environmental concerns. So people are trying to look at these different relationships using this data. So I'll encourage you to just look at that and see if this would be helpful in your research, in your work, or if you just would like to just view it for your local area.
And now we've got a lot of questions. The first question is, do you measure criminal backgrounds along race and housing equity? I'm not sure I really understand the question. So the mapping tool just looks at racial composition and racial residential segregation using different measures. The project looks at the correlates and does regression analysis, correlation analysis between measures of segregation and different life outcomes. We did not look at criminal backgrounds in doing our correlation analysis. We looked at, was it 20 some variables? We published over 12, I think. No, it was more than that. And I showed some of the tables in my presentation on that. In our broader race and housing equity work, we do actually look not at criminal backgrounds, but we actually look at crime as an opportunity indicator. So in our work with the state and our work with jurisdictions, we actually do look at crime. But our work is not mostly about individual race, it's about race at the aggregate level or race as a sociological factor that influences life outcomes. So it's hard for me to understand what your question means. It's kind of vague, and I'm not sure, anyway, there's some ambiguities in there. Second question, Samir, did you want to respond to that question before I move to the next? Okay. Second question, how does this data get used to help with city planning in California? I'm curious about trying to diversify intentionally when planning for need housing developments. Again, that's a very complicated and ambiguous question. So first of all, there are a lot of city planning processes in California. There is housing element process, which is I think mostly unique to California. There's RHNA, which is about planning for different income levels in housing units. There is AFFH processes. I don't know how this may or may not be used in those processes. We don't directly help with that, nor do we actually advise cities on zoning. What we do help with is the state and some jurisdictions on affordable housing siting policy. So not city planning per se, but affordable housing siting. And we have used these resources to try and inform that process. Samir, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. And this is what we were mentioning. I was mentioning at the end of the presentation that we in 2017 HCD and TCAHC constituted a fair housing task force within California, and we were part of that to create an empirical framework so that they could identify different levels of opportunity neighborhoods within the state and develop a policy that can incentivize siting large family LIHTC housing in high opportunity areas. So the task force, we proposed this opportunity mapping framework where segregation was one of the filters. What this filter did was to actually separate out low and lowest opportunity census tracts. And we use this framework to inform HCD and the users as to what is the distribution of opportunity. And HCD and TCAHC actually use this to develop a policy guidelines with developers to ensure that the new housing is developed in high opportunity neighborhoods.
And the focus there is really trying to make sure that children and families have better life outcomes. And the state could have used the Chetty Opportunity Atlas, but the reason it didn't is because the Opportunity Atlas is backward looking. It was about children who were growing up in the early 1980s. And as we know, circumstances have changed dramatically since then. Right? We have the internet didn't exist. Silicon Valley, as it is now known, didn't really exist in the same way. Lots of new industries have come into being. So we're much more prospective and forward looking. And that tool has been used by the state and it's actually been hard to beat back legislators and other entities and agencies from adopting that tool. I think it's gotten a lot of, it's highly influential, but it's not our segregation tool. Segregation is a filter. So there's that. Logan asks, how has this tool been received in CA, been used to help connect residents with affordable housing opportunity? Well, again, we have used segregation as a filter to try to identify places that are low or higher in opportunity. It's not the main driver. So we use opportunity maps in conjunction with segregation maps. But the segregation mapping tool was not really about identifying opportunity per se. It's about trying to figure out how to inform planning processes and inform affordable housing siting policies when making decisions. And specifically to try and avoid things that just resegregate, whether it's in segregated white communities or segregated communities of color, and to try and create more integration across the state or the country, right? That's what the mapping tool is for. We hope that's how, specifically the racial residential segregation mapping tool that we presented today. Another question, in Connecticut, approximately 25% of our residents have a criminal background, race being a factor with 87% of that, 25% are minorities. How can I use your data to show people with criminal backgrounds are a minority race? Well, our mapping tool is about racial composition and racial residential segregation. The mapping tool itself does not have any other, in fact, we were very deliberate. We didn't want to add education and employment rates and test scores and there's all sorts of things we could have layered onto this, policing information. We just wanted to create the most sophisticated, most tailored, most focused segregation mapping tool in the country, if not the world. Again, it's the most multifunctional. It has every major measure of segregation on it. You can go at almost any geography, census tract, municipality, metro area, county. We wanted to create by far the most sophisticated tool. It doesn't have things that are not about racial composition or racial segregation in there. It's not about anything else. So our mapping tool is not going to be able to help you if you're looking for crime rates or criminal background at the individual level. This is about segregation, which I really tried to be clear on at the beginning of the presentation when I went through terms.
And just to add to that, if you want to run your own analysis looking at the correlation, you can always download the data and then run that correlation on your own.
Chelsea, I think we can wrap. I saw you popping up.
I don't see any additional questions in the chat, but I want to thank Stephen and Samir. Thank you so much for this presentation. And if folks have follow-up questions, we'll make sure to get those to you. And thank you for providing the link to the tool in the chat. Maybe, I think, I'm not sure who did, maybe you can pop it in again so it's at the top of folks' queue, but thank you again. Our next session is starting in just about 5 minutes. It's zoning and housing, best practices and challenges across New England. So you'll get a chance to hear from folks from outside of Connecticut on best practices and challenges in zoning. So that starts at 1:30. And thank you to the over 100 folks that joined us for this great conversation. And I'll look forward to seeing you all throughout the conference. Thank you, Stephen and Samir.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thanks, everyone.